Hello, my name is Niall McKay and welcome to Living with PSC, a podcast about the rare disease of primary sclerosing cholangitis. Now, PSC causes the bile ducts inside and outside the liver to become scarred, narrowed and eventually blocked, and leads to liver cirrhosis. In this podcast, we aim to dispel some of the myths about the disease. We talk to the experts, the research scientists, the doctors and the patients. Above all, we hope to shed some light on the science and research behind PSC, which is often misunderstood by both doctors and patients alike. And today we're talking to Dr. Gideon Hirschfield, Professor of Autoimmune Diseases at the University of Birmingham. It does seem that diseases like PSC are on the rise, doesn't it?
Well, it feels that way. And so our data doesn't really show that the incidence of PSC has changed, but probably it is. And probably that's because there's more inflammatory bowel disease. And so we expect that as you get more inflammatory bowel disease, you will see more PSC. The proof will come actually if countries like India and China study PSC. And as they get more inflammatory bowel disease, if we start to see more PSC, that will actually teach us something about the cause of PSC and this link between inflammatory bowel disease and the liver inflammation. So, and additionally, we're much more tuned in to picking up the full spectrum of disease, whereas before, of course, it was you had to wait until it was very severe to get picked up. We're much better with liver tests and with MRI imaging. And that's why people are always very nervous about talking about true increases in incidence and prevalence, because you never quite know whether it's just because you're testing more.
Can we talk a little bit about the rise or the autoimmune diseases and also the gut bio or the gut biome? You know, just is there a connection between that? Just from what you just said, it seems like there might be.
Yes, it's the simple answer, but the complex answer is we don't know why. And the issue is we know that these diseases are genes and environment. We know that your genes don't change, obviously. That takes hundreds and thousands of years for genes to change. And we know that the gene changes are quite subtle because there's plenty of people with the same gene changes who don't get the disease. But then what we've also learned is that environmental triggers must be important. And when we think about the environment, we no longer think in just classical terms of toxins that appear and you ingest them, but we, for example, or drugs. We also think about your own environment. And when you think about your own environment, really then nowadays we're thinking about the microbiome. And the microbiome is all the bacteria and maybe other things like fungi, viruses, bacteriophages that live within your bowel and live in harmony most of the time, nearly all the time, in fact. And there's a communication between what they make and your colon wall and your small bowel wall. And that affects the immune system. And you have a similar set of bacteria on your skin. And so, for sure, that is important in the generation of autoimmune diseases. Quite hard to study. And every now and then there's a new breakthrough that suggests they understand it more. I would be surprised if it's one bacteria as opposed to just themes of what bacteria make. And what we could say for reasonable certainty is our diets have changed enormously over the last 100 years. And maybe that is what's expressing some autoimmune phenomena. On top of that, you then have to really get to the nitty-gritty around PSC IBD, which is that classically PSC is associated with inflammatory bowel disease. And so it's even more relevant for patients with PSC IBD because not only have they often got inflammation in their colon, they've also got then this inflammation tracking into their bile ducts as well. So I'm sure it's relevant. The real challenge is knowing how to harness that knowledge. How would we develop therapies? Because it seems unlikely when you look at the spectrum of people who get this disease that it's going to be really completely simple and one change will reset everything, because it just doesn't make sense that it will be that black and white. It's more likely to be shades of grey, and therefore trying to work out what the intervention needs to be to make it a
So if
treatment
you like,
is the next challenge.
to create an analogy for that, if your microbiome is more like an orchestra than a single singer, is what you're saying.
I think so. I mean, because, your microbiome probably changes every time you eat. We know that the microbiome is affected by the drugs you take, where you live, your age, etc., etc. So it seems a bit simplistic to say it's one bacteria difference, and that's the reason you get an autoimmune disease. It's much more likely to be an orchestra effect, and there may be then within that orchestra different components of the orchestra which sound louder to the immune system, and some components which sound quieter. And then there may be threshold effects. So it may not be a be-all and end-all. It may be it builds up over time, which again might make sense for how patients present. And then the real challenge is, let's say the microbiome is very important in triggering the disease. How important is it in continuing the disease? And that's really something we have to study much more. And it's actually very difficult to study, because this isn't an orchestra just with 20 instruments. It might be an orchestra with 1 million different instruments.
Yeah, and so if you're talking about that though, how does microbiome? How does that then restrict? Does it create a blockage in the bile ducts, or how does it turn it into a smaller?
No. There's two things about them. So nothing direct. So there's two points. Number one, there must be a crosstalk between the bacteria in the bowel and what they make and your colon wall. So that's called mucosal immunology. So how is it that the way to think about it is, why do more people not have colitis rather than why do people get colitis? Because if you think about it, we're all living with enormous populations of bacteria in our bowel, yet for the large part, our bowel is not inflamed. And yet all of those bacteria make products that are inflammatory. So there's a communication. You live together. There's a symbiosis. So that's one factor. And then, so the presumption is there's a subtle change in that symbiosis because the microbiome changes, and maybe your immune system is slightly skewed to responding in a more vigorous way if the microbiome changes. And then the second thing around PSC specifically is it just the bacteria in the bowel, or could it be bacteria in the bile? Are there bile duct bacteria and viruses, bacteriophages, you name it, that may be relevant to the inflammation that we see? So that's what adds to this complexity for PSC IBD, because we see the inflammation in the bowel, we see the inflammation in the bile ducts, and we're trying to work out whether the inflammation in the bile ducts really is just an aberrant recirculation of inflammation in the colon, or is it being triggered by changes in the bile as well?
I see. So that would explain why a liver transplant wouldn't always be a cure.
Well, exactly. I mean, and that's another whole webinar in its own right. But I mean, we know that for all autoimmune diseases, giving the patient a new liver doesn't stop you from getting the disease back. And so that's exactly so. And in many ways, that might actually, particularly for PSC IBD, strengthen the idea that the disease does come from the colon for a large part, because it can come back into a completely unrelated liver. That liver obviously doesn't look like you genetically, and it's not usually matched unless it's a live donor transplant, in which case it's not matched properly, but it has some matching. So that's a very good point to highlight where the deficit may be. And again, I don't want to use the word, using the word deficit is thematic really, because the detail is almost certainly much, much more subtle, complex. And the other thing that we always forget in disease is, well, there's two things. One is we forget about what happens in health, and actually we can learn a lot about that. And the second thing is we forget that things change over time. And in fact, when you get inflammation, your body responds to try and get rid of it. And that may be relevant as well. Your response to injury, not just the injury itself. And we know from other examples that, some people respond to injury in a very mild way and other people have an exuberant response. And you even see that with something as common as influenza, so common flu. We know that there's always tragic stories about someone who was completely healthy, who got influenza, who got very, very sick very quickly. But we don't quite know why. And that's the same concept as to if you got colitis or I got colitis, maybe mine is actually mild because I'm better at responding and yours is more severe, not because the insult was stronger, just because your elastoplast was not as good.
And so do you think that the food has an issue to play here, like what one actually ingests?
Well, look, I think there are two ways of answering that question. I don't think that we have any evidence that you should change your diet other than to be healthy. And secondly, it comes back to this whole concept about it being much more complex than just one bacteria or one kind of diet. So yes, I think it would be hard to say that nutrition isn't relevant, but no, is nutritional therapy going to be the answer? Not presently, but in the broader sense, if somebody with colitis is not fed and they're fed intravenously, then the colitis does get better. But that's not a sustainable reality.
Let's talk about some of the clinical endpoints, just since it's one of the areas. What are the clinical endpoints to help find treatments for PSC?
So PSC is very difficult to study because on the one hand, you know the unmet need. It's stark and it's in your face for the patients and for the clinicians. High risk of transplant, risk of recurrent disease, risk of cancer. However, unlike other liver diseases, which often are prone to affect just liver cells, this is a disease of the bile ducts, and so there's lots of variation in the disease itself. And you can go from being well to being ill very quickly, and you can't always predict it. And that's been our struggle. So the obvious endpoints would be not needing a liver transplant or living longer or not developing cancer. They're great endpoints in theory, but fortunately, they take a long time to come for the patients. So they aren't very practical endpoints for clinical trials because you'd have to wait many, 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 many years. Then you flip it around and say, well, I don't want to wait many years. Why don't I use blood tests? And broadly, blood tests like alkaline phosphatase and other liver tests are not bad when you put all the data together collectively for a big group of patients with PSC. But on an individual level, they fluctuate quite a lot. And so they can be helpful at the early stages of drug development for PSC, particularly if the drug works on the bile duct inflammatory pathway. But in later stages, the fluctuation means that, quite rightly, the regulators will not be able to believe that a change is necessarily definitely associated with preventing you having something later on like a transplant. So liver tests have some use at the very beginning of drug development, but get more challenging later as you develop drugs. And then there's everything in the middle. So maybe we should measure how much scarring there is. And then the question is, how do you do that? Do you do a liver biopsy? A very good test, but to be fair to patients, not many people like liver biopsies, but it's a very good test. How often do you do it? You probably can only do it every year, maybe every 2 years. If you can't do a liver biopsy in everyone, or you'd like to develop drugs a bit quicker, maybe you use blood tests which look at liver scarring. That's something which is very exciting, and we're starting to learn a lot about blood tests for liver fibrosis. And that may change how we do studies in PSC, but all liver disease, because we'll look at sensitive blood tests of ongoing scarring and healing and see whether they change over time. And maybe we'd hypothesize that a drug that improves those markers of scarring then is definitely a drug that's worth having a trial that goes on for many years, where you use a even more invasive
so we're
test
looking
like a
at
liver
these
biopsy.
drugs such as NGM282 and drugs like that are having some success with other diseases,
Yes.
such as fatty liver disease. Yeah,
Exactly. So, and that's very interesting, and there will be more data presented about that this year in 2018 about drugs like that. And we're seeing whether or not there might be opportunities to get the markers of scarring and see whether or not they help. Now, the challenge there is we don't know enough about those markers of scarring in health and we don't know enough about the variation in PSC just generally, which does make it a bit harder. And then the last thing which we should be better at, but we haven't quite cracked yet, is what to do about imaging. So we take pictures of the bile duct all the time with MRI, and yet we haven't really been able to find really good scoring systems to score those MRI. But we can see that from other studies that have been done already, how the liver looks, how big it is, how big the spleen is, etc., can be very helpful in predicting what's going to happen to patients. And so we've got a lot to do. We kind of know how to improve these markers, but what we've not been so good at is having enough information about normal variation in health and disease, because that then allows you to work out what you'd have to see to say that your drug has had an effect. Because, of course, what a regulator wants to know is, say you use blood test X, well, what happens to blood test X over 24 hours, 48 hours, 3 months, 9 months, 12 months in a normal person with PSC where you do nothing? And that's the reason why when we do these studies, we have to try and persuade our industry colleagues that they're long enough and that they have a placebo group. Because although no one wants to be on placebo, that placebo group is worth everything as the comparator.
Great. And one of the things that when we were talking just there about it, it seems to me that for patients, I mean, certainly for PSC patients, they talk about, the various symptoms that they, encounter, such as, fevers and chills. And generally speaking, people seem to be on this sort of progression where antibiotics work for clearing up the infections.
Yeah.
And then they stop working, and then they go in for ERCPs, and then that stops working. And then, so it seems there is a progression of the illness, or there seems to be. Is that your experience? Or?
For sure. This is generally a progressive disease. Not everyone progresses. As I mentioned, we can diagnose the disease much better than we used to. So we're seeing the whole spectrum, mild, moderate, severe. And some patients progress quicker than others, and other patients have very mild disease. It's interesting, we can actually use simple risk scores based on blood tests, which are quite good at predicting your 10-year risk of progression, looking at the liver tests and how much inflammation there is. So the truth is the majority of patients will progress, and that would mirror the data that the majority of patients will need to have a liver transplant to prevent them succumbing from the complications of PSC. That majority is by definition defined as more than 50%. So that still means there's a large number who don't.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between a full liver transplant and a partial liver transplant? And then are there people actually just replacing bile ducts at this stage? Or
so we'll go backwards. We're not replacing bile ducts at this stage. There's been a lot of interest in artificially developed sort of scaffolds of human tissue, including bile ducts, and it's very appealing. But it would be very difficult in PSC, which is a multifocal biliary stricturing disease, because there's not just one bit of your bile ducts that's narrowed. But it's certainly something that in the future we know we need to keep an eye on. The next thing to say about transplant really is that it doesn't really matter to the patient whether they're given a whole liver or a partial liver, because that will work. What matters is they take the old liver out. And at present, that's what people get when they get transplanted. They get orthotopic liver transplantation. So their liver is taken out and is replaced with somebody else's. And then really whether you get a whole liver or a partial liver, a split graft or a live donor graft, depends on where you live and the access to liver transplant material. And the whole challenge we now have is that liver transplantation is now a routine operation. Our surgeons are very good at it. Our physicians who look after them, such as we do here, are very good at it. Anaesthetists are very good at it. Intensive care doctors are very good at it. And the only issue is getting the organ. So that depends on where you live. In some programs, it's easy to get whole livers from people who are deceased. In other programs, there's a greater reliance on live donor transplants, where clearly if someone is a live donor, they can only give a part of their liver because they still need their liver. But because the liver regenerates, that's okay. And clearly, they each have pluses and minuses. So a minus of waiting for a whole liver might mean that you wait longer. Whereas a minus of having a split liver might mean that you get more complications, because technically the surgeon had to split the liver, and anything that they do to the liver is more complex than leaving it as a whole. So that would be the distinction I would make around that, rather than thinking in other ways.
And is there a difference between, for PSC patients, is there a difference between the various different types of ducts or strictures that do get blocked? Like there's some that are in the liver that are harder to, you know, that are more difficult. Is that right?
Well, yes, in simplistic terms, I'd agree that you've only got one large common bile duct, and then that splits, and then that splits. But eventually you get down to lots of small bile ducts. And clearly, if the one large bile duct gets narrowed and blocked, then that's a disaster. And ultimately, usually that patient will need a transplant, and the rest of the liver might be okay. But the liver won't work if the largest bile ducts are blocked. And so that is always a concern. Practice is actually very variable for PSC around the world. Our practice is not to do a lot of ERCPs. It's very unusual in our practice to do any ERCPs, whereas other people believe very clearly that this is a tubular disease, that the disease manifestations relate to blockages, and therefore if you try and relieve blockages, then that's good for the patient. The challenge is that it's a minority who've only got the blockages just in the big bile ducts, as opposed to the majority who've got multifocal disease throughout the liver.
I see.
And if you've got multifocal disease, you can't really fix. Fixing one blockage means nothing because there's 25 other ones.
So stents is not something that is a practice in your area either, is it? Or putting a stent?
So that's very interesting. So again, if you look at how PSC is managed around the world, there's very differing practice. So in our practice, we don't do very much ERCP and we don't do very many stents. And my experience would be that stents can be cosmetic to the blood tests, but they don't really change what's happening to the patient. And my greater concern is stents and balloon dilatations carry real risk for the patients in terms of complications. Now, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be patients who need to have ERCP. There are times when people are very worried about bile duct cancer, and it's a very difficult disease to diagnose, but we know that it's a real challenge if you do get it. And that sometimes drives people's practice around ERCPs and brushings and stents, et cetera, et cetera.
And what about URSO?
Well, I'm on the spectrum of people who believe it's a homeopathic drug for PSC. And my personal interpretation of the data is that URSO does not work, that it does not have a material impact on the outcome of patients with PSC. And if it's having an impact, it's so mild that we can't notice it. I argue that apart from the trial data, which is equivocal, we see no real change in the number of people needing a transplant for PSC, despite lots of areas having a relatively high common use of ursodeoxycholic acid. So my take on is that it might have some soothing effects, but those soothing effects are not good enough for what our patients want and deserve, which is prevention of liver transplantation for the majority.
And you mentioned a blood test that can give you, what's the name of the blood test that can give you an idea of where you are on the spectrum?
Well, there are scores which use different blood tests.
Yeah.
The simple blood test is the alkaline phosphatase. And so that's not a perfect test, but usually the amount of bile duct disease that you have relates to how high your alkaline phosphatase is. And usually if your alkaline phosphatase is normal, that usually suggests that the disease is milder. It's not perfect, it fluctuates, but we know that a reasonable predictor that you're in a group which is at risk is having a high alkaline phosphatase. It's not as simple as it sounds, because alkaline phosphatase can fluctuate, and other liver tests are probably just as important. So your AST and your ALT, which are markers of liver inflammation, are very important in PSC, and maybe markers of how quickly you're developing cirrhosis. And so a drug that improves those could be very appealing.
Well, I think, is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to cover?
I think the two things that I think are important are trying to persuade clinicians that their patients should be in clinical trials wherever possible, and trying to encourage patients to think like that as well. And it's very difficult to be a patient with PSC because when you're well, you probably don't want to be in a clinical trial. You're busy doing other things. But we have never, ever come across a drug in liver disease that works best by waiting until everything's very advanced. And so if we're going to crack this puzzle, and we should crack it, because with the amount of effort going into PSC and the different drug targets that are being suggested, then really we should be able to make progress in the next 10 years with PSC. However, the best way, the most efficient way, is to work together.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in general, I think we're just lacking data, aren't we, across the board with it?
We're lacking, exactly, because it's a rare disease. We're lacking, because to get good data costs money, and it's not rocket science to get good data, but someone's going to write it down, share it, put it in a database, analyze it, and they're all the sort of things that are difficult to get funded. And yet, if we had that kind of data, it would be a wealth of data to have it, what we would use the word prospectively. So as you're diagnosed, you get followed up every 3, 6, 12 months. And to put all that data into one place, because suddenly then you've got the world of all the different technologies to understand the disease better. And it's just a reality of how we all work in healthcare environments that are under strain. And so research is under strain. There isn't really resource to do the simplest thing, which is collecting samples and clinical information. And moreover, collecting permission to contact patients again. So that you repeatedly test the same patient over time. But when you find something, you can say, would you like to be involved from a central resource? And I think the charity's been working on that, and it's certainly an aspiration of academics to be more joined up. I think we're very lucky in the PSC world to have PSC charities like PSC Partners and PSC Support in the UK who are very committed, who understand the problem, who want to help. And our challenge has been just to try and up the ante a bit and be more organized to get more people involved across different sites, because it's a rare disease and you want to collect patients of all stages, mild disease, moderate disease, severe disease. And then you want the data to be good enough quality that a statistician who really understands the disease could make headway into it. So I think we should congratulate the PSC Partners for their efforts, because I think it's very helpful.
Great. Well, you've been a mine of information.
Well,
so thank you very much.
About PSC, it's one of our passions to really build programs that help patients with PSC, and it's one of the reasons why I'm moving my program from the UK to Toronto, and we'll be building a centre of excellence so that there is, opportunity for patients who live in Ontario with all autoimmune liver diseases, but PSC in particular, to really drive home the chance to get new therapies. Because I am convinced that with a bit of money, that there is no reason why we cannot solve this problem in the next 10 to 20 years.
And when you say solve, what do you mean?
I don't think we can cure it because it's too complicated, but I really believe that we should be able to find a combination of drugs that can effectively reduce the amount of inflammatory inflammation we see in the bile ducts, in the liver and outside the liver. It makes no sense to me that with all these new drugs being developed, that we won't be able to find a cocktail of 2 or 3 drugs that is anti-inflammatory and anti-fibrotic and has the ability to then sort of switch off a lot of the problems that our patients get.
And where would you think about things like, fecal transplants and all that kind of stuff?
I think that's a great idea. We're trying to set that up in the UK, in Birmingham, and we're nearly ready to start doing a pilot study of fecal transplant for colitis, and patients with PSC will be able to take part. I think that all comes down to this business of clinical trials, and I think that we need a healthy body of clinical trials to help us go forward. And each trial teaches you something, even if it's not positive. And it would be perfectly logical to consider a trial of fecal microbial transplantation for this disease. Great.
Well, thank you very much. This has been so helpful and a very, very interesting podcast. So thank you very much for your time.
I hope so. I look forward to listening to it as well.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this week. For more information about PSC and for a list of people and topics we'll be covering in the near future, please go to www.pscpartners.org. That's www.pscpartners.org. PSC Partners is a non-profit organisation dedicated to providing education and support to primary sclerosing cholangitis patients. There is information and resources on the website. There is a conference once a year. There is a private Facebook group that you can also join. Also, please join our patient registry. This is an anonymous database that provides research support to the medical community who are researching this disease. Thank you very much for listening.